good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Welcome, welcome. We're so excited to have you guys. We're gonna wait till everyone comes in. Welcome. This is so exciting. So we have to tell you, we have about almost 300 of you registered today, with almost 200 of you joining us already this morning. My name is Joanna Deshay, and I have the extreme pleasure of serving as the executive director of this organization. We're going to ask you all to just go ahead and mute your Zoom if you don't mind, and if you would go ahead and turn your cameras off so we can get through kind of the intro pieces of this morning and get ready for our presentation. For those of you that are new to our organization, welcome. Diversity Leadership Alliance is an almost 20-year-old diversity education organization. For those of you that are not new, welcome back. Actually, what I'm going to do before we get into this uncomfortable conversations that ignite slide, I'm going to ask Brent if he could take it down for just a second, because I want to just give some quick thank yous. Yes, wonderful. Good morning, good morning. I see my good friend Sal is here. I always like to see who's here. I see Marion Kelly is here. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Good morning to Carol. See, this is like being in, you know, when you invite people for coffee in the morning, I like to see who's joining me. So welcome, welcome. I am so excited about this series, because this is a dialogue series that we talked about for quite some time. We really wanted an opportunity for us to have conversations that matter, meaningful conversations that would impart change. Something that, that felt a little uncomfortable, felt a little uneasy, but at the end of the day, in order to grow, and you know this, in order to grow, sometimes you have to be broken open a little bit. It's just like working out, right? Strain that muscle a little bit, but at the end of the day, it's stronger, it's bigger, right? You can flex more. And so that's what this is all about. So you all are here as our advocates. You are our ambassadors into the community. The only thing we ask for all of you is that the information that you learn today, the information that you learn in subsequent dialogues, is that you take it and share it, because it is our gift from DLA to you. I would be remiss if I didn't take just a minute to thank our DLA board of directors. We have an amazing board of directors that really drive this ship from a strategic perspective. And I see that he's in much cooler weather than we are. I see our co-founder, Mr. Marion Kelly, joining us today. So there he is. Mr. Kelly is joining us from California, I believe. So he's somewhere much nicer than we are, people. So we're in Arizona in 117. But I would be remiss if I did not mention him. He and Christine French, the late Christine French, were the geniuses and kind of the soul trust behind the creation of this organization. And it's all about equity, it's all about inclusion, and it's all about belonging. So we design programs that are about education, not advocacy, not politics, so we don't play in politics, right? We educate, and we've been educating for the last 20 years. We're really also excited about the series that we've created, Uncomfortable Conversations to Ignite Change. And these series are going to take you through a series of dialogues, starting with today's amazing dialogue that will set the stage for all of the subsequent conversations you will hear. Today's dialogue is going to talk about race and racism, and all of the subject matters that you see that we're going to cover was really thought about with quite, specific purpose by our education committee. So while you see me sitting here, there's so many individuals that I stand, with that have really designed these amazing programs, many of which are on today's call. So I want to just take just a few seconds to just acknowledge our education committee. You see some of them here, Miss Jackie Stocks, you see, right? Thank you, Carol, you know this, Dr. Brett Scholar, you see Betty Thompson there at the top. Tondra Richardson is at the bottom somewhere. So we are guided by Dr. Mallory Titel. I don't know if Dr. Titel is on the call, but she is the head of the Education Committee. So while you see me, one soul, right, we are guided by many. So I just wanted to remind you all that this is a group effort, and I do not for one instance take that for granted. So thank you to the DLA Education Committee. I also want to thank our conference committee. We're planning this stellar conference that's folded into the dialogue series, because we didn't feel like we could go off on a tangent and have a conference that didn't encompass everything that we're doing. So I want to share with you what that lays out like and what those conversations will look like. So I would love for Brent to bring that slide back in so you can see all of the conversations that we're going to have, starting with today's dialogue number 1, which is going to be on race and racism. Then we will move into dialogue number 2, which will talk a little bit more about the idea of implicit racial bias. And then we will go into micro and macro aggressions, and that will lead us into a 2-day deep dive at the DLA conference, where we will talk about trauma. There's a lot of that going on right now, especially for, you know, my brothers and sisters in the African American community, and just really all of us across, you know, the board, when we look at the trauma of racism and discrimination. But we're not going to stop there. We're going to own that trauma. We're going to work through that trauma, and then we're going to come back on day 2 and talk about, now, how do we heal that trauma? That's really important, because you can't do trauma work, right, without talking about solutions and what that healing process could look like, because we can't keep the good fight going if we're not healed and whole. And then we are going to look at the idea of white fragility, and also the idea of allyship and advocacy, and what does it look like to be a true ally that stands for anti-racism, right? What does it look like to be anti-racist? And you'll hear some comments about that also today. And then we will end with dialogue number 5, which will look at privilege, and not just where you hear privilege in terms of race, but we're going to talk about privilege in terms of gender. Right? We're going to talk about privilege in terms of economics. We're going to talk about privilege in terms of class. We're going to talk about privilege in terms of even in the work environment, how it's structured based on education, right? Or even the title that you hold within an organization. All of those things hold privilege. How do you recognize it, right? And even more than that, how do you use it to impart change? And how do you use it to advocate for someone that may be part of a marginalized, you know, community? Because there's privilege is powerful if you know how to use it. And that's really what we want to talk about. So I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that. The conference right now is one that we are really looking for sponsors. All of the work that we do, you all are here today, and how wonderful. By the way, I was so pleased this morning because Christine French's dream, and you know, Christine passed away last year, and one of her biggest dreams was for us to go international. She always wanted DLA to be felt around the world. And I gotta tell you, we're global today. We've got folks joining us from around the world today, and that's from Germany, and I think we've got another couple of folks coming in from Taiwan. And so, Christine, we got you. We're moving this thing forward in a manner that I think will do you very proud. So we're just really excited about not only the fact that we've got so many, but we're now global. So that's what this virtual platform has afforded us the opportunity to do, and we're very grateful for it. Conference sponsorships are available. So if you go to our website, you can download the conference sponsorship. And I say that to say, all of the work we do, like today's workshop, all of the other series of workshops are brought to you at no cost, right? There's no cost to it. And the way we're able to do that is by really having sponsors to be able to underwrite the cost of these workshops. And that is our goal. That's always been our goal, to ensure that cost is not a barrier, right? If someone wants the information, we want to get them the information, and we don't want cost to be a prohibitive barrier for them to get the information. So that's why we make these workshops at no cost, so you can have the opportunity to get the information, and most importantly, share the information. That's really important to us. So again, conference sponsorships are available. And I just want to take up just half a second also to welcome one of our new sponsors this year. So Central Arizona Project, CAP, welcome. So excited. Bridget, thank you so much. We are always looking for new sponsors, and Central Arizona Project came on just yesterday as a new sponsor. So if you have an organization that would like to sponsor this year's conference, definitely would love to have you as a sponsor. So welcome to Central Arizona Project. Okay, so that's kind of the welcome part of our program, and I don't want to take up too much time. I want to make sure we get to the program. So without further ado, and what we'll do is as we move through the program, we will give you all some guiding principles, if you would, for how to engage today. And it is about engagement. This is such an interactive presentation. As you hear the information that Dr. Davis will be presenting, we're going to break you out into some breakout groups so you can have some dialogue about it, right? And digest the information and check for your own understanding and see if personally you've been affected by it and what you've been doing to demonstrate some of these things. So it's going to be really important that, and we're going to break you out 2 times so you get a chance to experience several different individuals as you move through this presentation. So get ready to, get in there and roll your sleeves up and do a little thinking work this morning. So we're really excited about that. I have to tell you, I'm so excited because not only is this one of my favorite people. You have this favorite people, you don't see them for a while, and when you see them, you smile, just whether you're at an event or whatever. Dr. Davis is one of those individuals because she's got a spirit that is just absolutely delightful. And I am very humbled to know her, and I'm very humbled that she has the opportunity to present for us today. So you will get the opportunity to experience, and I'll call it that because I'm super excited. I've got my notebook, Dr. Davis, and I've got my pen. I'm all ready for you. So I would love to introduce you to today's presenter that will walk us through race and racism, which is dialogue 1 in this series. I would love to introduce you to Dr. Olga Davis, who is Dean Davis. She is the Associate Dean at the Barrett Honors College, the downtown campus. And Dr. Davis is also Professor of Communication at the Hugh Downs School of Human Communication. As though that were not enough to keep her busy, she's also President and CEO of Davis Communication Group. Dr. Davis is actually an LA native, Los Angeles. I didn't know this, so this was wonderful to read this, Dr. Davis. Not only is she an educator, she's also a former actor, having played on General Hospital. This was so wonderful to read because, film and TV, it's kind of my other world. On General Hospital, and she trained at Juilliard. She can be heard nationally on voiceovers from television and radio, and has a consulting practice that offers workshops, keynote consulting, and executive coaching to high potential and high performance leaders and their teams. So for a lot of you that are representing diverse organizations, Dr. Davis would be a wonderful person to bring in for a lot of your kind of cultural competency training that you may do, narrative management that you may do, and even career success training that you may be doing for your organization. Through motivational speaking, corporate coaching, and team building, she really empowers audiences to kind of reimagine their possibilities, their productivity, and purpose to embrace their greatest potential. Ladies and gentlemen, I guess we can't clap, but we could if we wanted to. Please welcome Dr. Olga Davis.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Thank you. And thank you very much, the team of DLA. I'd like to especially thank Ms. Joanna Deshay and Mr. Marion Kelly for inviting me today. Thank you so much. All right, I think we are ready. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the narrative of color, setting the tone for reimagining a new normal in race relations. And I'd like to start off with a poem that is very near and dear to my heart, and it is called, just one second here. I too am America. America, America, God shed his grace on thee and crown thy good with sisterhood from sea to shining sea. I too sing America. I am the darker sister. They tell me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. The poem by Langston Hughes, one of the most prolific and insightful American poets of the 20th century, captured the story of African Americans, Black Americans, in just one phrase: I too am America. The quest to becoming an American is an elusive journey, a circuitous process, a confusing identity, a wished for dream, a sought after but never truly attained life goal. The question continues to weigh on each generation coming and going. What does it mean to be an American? How can I sit at the proverbial table when company comes? Will I be seen as beautiful? When will my fellow Americans self-reflect and be ashamed? Today, I invite you, I challenge you, I encourage you, I implore you to join me on a journey to the iceberg, where we will explore the nature of systemic racism and its permutations we live each day and every day, and the effects such a way of life has on our society, our culture, and our nation. As this DLA series is so aptly titled, Uncomfortable Dialogues, you may find some discomfort in our discussion today, but that's okay. You're in a good space. If you are feeling uncomfortable, it means you are listening, you are self-reflecting, you're taking it all in and hopefully reassessing your own life to determine when and where will you make a change. Now, I want you to think about options. Options are the spice of life. And when we have options, we have selections, varieties, additional streams of vitality, ways of approaching challenges, and new ways of examining ourselves to heal and also to better our relations. Well, this presentation is titled in part, The Narrative of Color, because what is the story we want to tell ourselves about color? How do we negotiate our views, our attitudes, our behaviors about the skin color of human beings? What do we teach our children about with whom to play and whom to ignore based on the color of the story we tell? How does the narrative of color shape our understanding, serve as a receptacle for our fears, align with our stories of origin, of beliefs, and of values, and morality entrenched in the hidden views of fear and apprehension? Today marks the day to begin the journey to the iceberg. The purpose of this presentation on our journey is to set the tone for the possibility of transformation. That's what I'm hoping at the end of this presentation, you will feel that you're on the journey, that you're on the course for transformation. And to provide a purview is what we're trying to do, a schemata for examining race and racism in the context of systems of domination and power. More specifically, I want each of you to begin self-reflecting during my presentation and to take part in our breakout session for opportunities to engage with others in this uncomfortable dialogue of space. Scholars Lynn Miller and Jackie Taylor in 2006 wrote, quote, "Telling stories about oneself Listening and learning from the stories of others helps us to make sense of our world. And that's what we're trying to do today. Uncharted waters, turbulent tides, seeing the world through new lenses leads us to new metaphors. The iceberg, the tip of the iceberg, is something that is usually what we can see. We usually can see that tip of the iceberg. It sits above the water, huge blocks of ice, immovable, impermeable, impossible to transform. It is what we usually characterize as an iceberg. Because we can see it, we can easily believe that it is all that is there of the iceberg. But in fact, it isn't until we go beyond and into the depth of that iceberg, its vast territory of space that it takes up in the ocean, that all of what it is, we truly can view in awe. But underneath of that iceberg is the problem. It's what you cannot see. And that is where we will begin our transformation. So today I'd like to share with you the overview of our journey that we are going to take in that transformation, and that journey that we're closely coming to the iceberg. We're starting off with the role of narrative in contextualizing racism. We're learning about changing this narrative and how we might look at narrative differently, and how we might look at the issues that all of our cities, our countries, our states, our nations are dealing with, and that's the narrative of race and racism. We're going to look at and talk about the systems of racism. They include institutional, cultural, and personal bias. And after we discuss those aspects of the systems of racism, we will then break out into our questions and our breakout session. The role of narrative. Narrative means it is a story. When we think about narrative in our own lives, we think about the way in which we craft who we are, the way in which we talk about who we are, and how we talk about our relationships with others is oftentimes through this notion of story. Narrative means that there is a particular way or approach that we have to the way in which we look at the world. So for example, there are oftentimes stories that are called origin narratives, narratives of, for example, the Adam and Eve origin story. One could call that a narrative, how the world began. There are stories of the way in which individuals met. I'm sure you've had your relatives, your parents, or your loved ones, or maybe even your own personal love story is a narrative when you reiterate that story to your children and other loved ones. You're telling them about how you found this person in your life, how you have shared your life, and where your life is going now. So this idea of narrative is very much like that when we think about our social, cultural, political world. We think about narrative from the terms of what sorts of stories do we want to shape to create the society that we want to live in. And as you know, we have had many narratives in our world. We've had many narratives in our country of the United States. And some of those narratives have not always been delightful, have not always been lovely, have not always been supportive in engaging people's identity to make them feel like they're part of the American family. So the idea of the role of narrative helps us to contextualize or to create a format or a frame in which we're going to look at these different aspects of race and racism. I talked to you earlier about the iceberg, and I want you to take ourselves on this journey. I want you to think about yourselves being on this ship, and it looks like a very cold place. We see navigators in their orange parka jackets, probably very warm, but you can tell it's very, very cold. It's probably in Iceland. It might even be in Alaska, off the coast of Alaska. But wherever it is, it could be even in Norway, some of our Netherlands cultures and communities. But wherever it may be, and wherever you may find yourself on this journey to and toward the iceberg. As we approach the iceberg in our ship, we are on the ocean. It doesn't seem to be too rocky at the moment, but I'm certain that that water is very cold. But in front of us is an iceberg. We also know from some of the films that we've seen, the Titanic and other films, we know that ships and boats make sure that they circumvent, that they get around the iceberg. You never want to go into an iceberg because, of course, an iceberg is like a brick wall. It can kill you. It is immovable. It does not go anywhere, but stays in front of you. And if you are bold enough, it will take you out, as they say, because it is a very strong and rocky, although it's ice, sort of structure. So at the very top, that what we see here is genocide. When we look at the way we take that metaphor of the iceberg and we think about race and racism, we might say that when we look at this iceberg, we see genocide. We see some of the big overarching themes of race and racism, the big issues: genocide, the Ku Klux Klan, hate crimes, lynching, neo-Nazi groups, the KKK. But when we get down underneath in this area, I want you to begin thinking today that this is the journey that we're going into. We might have even needed a submarine to go into all of these different kinds of sorts of issues that we deal with on a daily basis. I'm going to just highlight a few of them. Hopefully you can read them on your own, but you will certainly maybe see them and maybe think about them and how they have impressed your life or maybe the lives that you know. The N-word is just under the surface of the water when an iceberg is in front of us. Racial slurs, swastikas, burning crosses, Confederate flags, the Jim Crow laws, police brutality, Chinese Exclusion Act, mass incarceration, school to prison pipeline, hiring discrimination, make America great again, racial profiling, Eurocentric curriculum, not challenging racist jokes, relieved we are post-racial and believing that we are post-racial, tokenism, not believing people of color's experiences, celebrating Columbus Day, virtuous victim narrative, denying racism, calling COVID-19 the Chinese virus, expecting people of color to teach white people. Well, I don't see color. That may also be something in our cacophony of voices underneath the ocean in our iceberg. And of course, the list goes on, but I've tried to highlight some that we might even talk about today. And then I also encourage you, even after our discussion today, to keep that discussion, to keep the thinking, to keep the self-reflection going. Institutional racism. I'd like to talk about institutional racism as that beginning place for how we understand racism. I call this, as my subtitle, a narrative of systems. Remember, narrative means story. So what story has been crafted? What story has been weaved into the fabric of our country to help us understand the ways in which institutional racism and other types of systems operate under the guise of racism. First of all, I'd like to have a few definition of terms, and there'll be about 6 terms that I think we need to know, and I put that up front so we can talk about them right away and you can begin thinking about them and contextualizing my talk to you today in terms of those terms and those definitions. Racism is the belief that groups of humans possess different behavioral traits corresponding to physical appearance and can be divided based on the superiority of one race over another. So hold that thought of superiority. Just put that on the side for a moment. But that is that foundational aspect of racism, the notion of superiority of one race over another. Now, institutional racism is a form of that racism that is embedded as normal practice within society or an organization. It can lead to such issues as discrimination in criminal justice, discrimination in employment, housing, healthcare, political power, education, among so many other issues. The systemic distribution of resources, the systematic distribution of resources of power and opportunity in our society to the benefit of people who are white and the exclusion of people of color. So this dynamic with the institution of racism constantly helps us to see that there's a tension. As Joanna said, this will be a performative kind of presentation. I have to kind of get into it. So sometimes you'll see me doing this stretching because I'm trying to give you the sense of what we call in communication studies, which is the field that I have received my PhD in and I teach and consult. We have a tension, we call it a dialectic. And there's this tension that continues to go from forward and back and in between races and between the way we have this distribution of resources, power, and opportunity. Now, our present day racism was built on a long history of racially distributed resources and ideas that shape our view of ourselves and others. It's a hierarchical system that comes with a broad range of policies and institutions that keep it in place. Now, some may say, well, I'm not a racist. Those are for those other people. So I thought, let's also talk in our discussion of institutionalized racism. Let's talk about what that means if a person is called that or embraces the term of racist. Racist means it is a person. It is a noun, a name for a person who shows or feels discrimination or prejudice against people of other races, or who believes that a particular race is superior to another. Now, the characteristics of racism are basically domination, oppression, power, and control. In this little color wheel, I've put in just to see and just to have you kind of look at how racism works and kind of weaves itself into our lives in a variety of ways at work, at school, in employment practices, in business, and so forth. There's oftentimes economic abuse. There are coercion and threats oftentimes. There's intimidation. This idea of using isolation, oftentimes not being a part of a group that you desperately want to be, but there's a sense that you aren't a part of that. Minimizing, denying, and blaming. And you feel maybe you think, I have done that. Maybe there's some characteristics that I have to work on. Or maybe you are the person who has experienced some of these. Using privilege as a way to treat people in a certain way. So there are so many tentacles to this behemoth that we can call that's in that underneath the iceberg and in the ocean that we call racism. So we're going to try and parcel it out a bit. And then anti-racism and anti-racist is another term that I wanted us to embrace in terms of definition. Anti-racism is the first one. It is the policy or practice of opposing racism and promoting racial tolerance. And so I think that's what we are about here with DLA, is promoting racial tolerance, promoting racial understanding, and realizing that if we are persons with some sort of name or noun that someone wants to give, let's think about maybe this one, which is anti-racist. It is a person who opposes racism. and promotes racial tolerance. So the two of those work in tandem. Discrimination is the act of making distinctions between human beings based on their groups, class, or other categories, and the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people, especially on the grounds of race, age, or sex, is what we call discrimination. Now, we all know that one of the foundational aspects of that iceberg here in the United States has been and was American slavery. It was the legal institution of human chattel, enslaving human beings, and it was also an economic system. It was foundational to the economy that we are still seeing even today in 2020. Primarily, the institution of human chattel included Native Africans and African Americans. That means the Africans who were then born on American soil, but they were enslaved. This existed in the United States from the beginning of the nation in 1776 until the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. Under that law, an enslaved person was treated as property and could be bought, sold, given away, beaten, raped, anything that you can think of, they were allowed to be treated in that way. Slavery lasted in about half of US states until 1865. So we're going to take now our journey into the west coast of Africa. We're going to go to Senegal, West Africa. I happen to have been able to be there. I've been to Senegal, West Africa. And the photo on the image on the left side of your screen is the door of no return in Senegal, West Africa. The photo or image on the right, which also is where I was. I took a photo right here and I toured inside of this area at the very bottom, which is where the slave quarters were. They were caves, actually. They were called slave caves. And then at the very top here is where the colonizers lived, the generals, the soldiers. They had their mess hall, if you will, is what it was called, the mess hall, that they would eat, dance, and then plan what their next activity was later that night with any of the enslaved Africans, or planning their journey across the Atlantic. On the left, this is a picture of the door of no return. It's called that because it is the closest spot, the very last place to be in Senegal, West Africa, before you would stand on a plank right here to go over across the little water there onto the ship that was right on the other side of that door. And if you did not walk on that plank as an enslaved African, your heart would be cut out to use as a sample for others who were attempting resistance. And then they would throw the heart into the water. The many fish and sharks would come up because they knew it was a feeding frenzy. They smelled blood and meat. And if you did not walk on that plank to the slave ship, you would be thrown into the water. This place, Gorée Island, is that terrible place that was a holding place for Africans prior to their entrance onto the slave ship. Slavery, that peculiar institution, as it's called in some of the slave narratives. As you can see very clearly, a slave auction block, children were also auctioned off, so parents never saw them again oftentimes. They could be at any variety of slave plantations in other states. So the mother, father could be at separate places, and it broke up the family, and children could be in another place as well. Having been beaten with the whip, oftentimes many enslaved Africans' backs and other parts of their bodies looked like that. Then came emancipation. That was to emancipate enslaved Africans. President Lincoln in 1863 signed this document, which proclaimed that persons held as slaves are henceforth shall be free. And then Reconstruction came, and there was still killing. There was still a sense of lynching. On the left here, you see lots of people with hats, and actually good folk who were dressed up like in their Sunday best to come out for a lynching, to see African American or enslaved or maybe recently freed Black men and Black women and children strung up to a tree. Many times their innards, as they would call them, cut out. Certainly there were dismemberments that happened to bodies. There were castrations of men, variety of different horrible pictures that certainly if you're interested in this sort of thing, you can certainly go on Google and see many of them that are there. And the Ku Klux Klan was rising in this time as well, to make sure that even though there was emancipation, there was a foothold in keeping Blacks in their place. Then came the 13th Amendment. And this amendment to the US Constitution abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime. In Congress, it was passed by the Senate on the 8th of April, 1864, by the House in January of 1865. The amendment was ratified by the required number of states on December 6th of 1865. But there's something about that 13th Amendment that we will see in a little bit. That 13th Amendment, we didn't see it really coming into being because there were some who did not, so let me go back here for a minute. There were some who did not know about that 13th Amendment, and they were the enslaved Africans who were still on the plantation in Galveston, Texas, and in different parts of Texas. You may have heard of Juneteenth. It was a big thing this year because of all of our social protests and unrest recently in June. And so we have heard quite a few people learning about it for the first time, knowing about it. Juneteenth was the commemoration when those slaves in Galveston, Texas, were finally told 2.5 years later, after the Emancipation Proclamation, 2.5 years later, that they were in fact free. Then moving on into the Midwest, we're looking at Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Tulsa race riot of 1921 was a catastrophic massacre, as it's now called. This place and this event is very near and dear to my heart because my paternal side of the family is from Tulsa. My grandfather, who was one of the first physicians in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who helped start the Greenwood community that you see on the right, who also went to Meharry Medical School and graduated at Meharry Medical School, moved into the Midwest, into Oklahoma after graduating from Meharry Medical School. And so this idea of Tulsa was a thriving Black community. It was that community where the freed African Americans, the first new generation of Black community members were saying, we can finally understand what does it mean to be an American? How can we be a part of this American dream? How can we actualize self-sufficiency? How can we have this development of an economic system of empowerment in terms of having our own businesses, having that distribution of dollars moving around at least 10 times within our community before it goes out of our community? How can we create a community of business owners and professional class of individuals like my uncle and others who I've met over the years, who were professionals, who were undertakers for the Black community. Now you may say, well, why did they separate themselves? Why did they want ownership of their land just by themselves? Well, it wasn't that they wanted that. It was because of Jim Crow laws. It was because of the situation that they were free, but a large faction of America did not want them to be a part of the American dream, a part of land ownership, a part of economic system of empowerment. And so at every turn that they would try to develop in their community, someone was trying to tear it down and find ways to mitigate the work that they were attempting to do. And I should go back. And then in 1921, it was a huge fire that occurred. You may be hearing about a lot of this because the centennial in 2021 in Tulsa, Oklahoma is being built up to commemorate this massacre and so many people who died as a result of it. On both sides, but particularly the Black community, the Black business community of Greenwood was decimated and never came back to its full regnancy, its full royalty, as it were, after that Tulsa massacre. Then we move forward from that 1921 period into the civil rights era, just about 30 years later. But civil rights, as we know, here's that term Jim Crow. Jim Crow meant you stay on your side of town, Black people. We have our side of town as white people. You can work for us, but you must be back on your side of town by sundown. And never should the two communities meet, other than, you know, business situations if you are a service person working for a white person or a white family or business. So this idea of segregation and Jim Crow was very much the foundation for civil rights. We see that again in Selma and people fighting and working and protesting, as we've seen in these days, for freedom, for justice, for school desegregation, for integrating schools, for having decent housing. It's amazing if you've lived long enough to be able to see how the tide of time goes, that some of these things are happening all over again. It seems like in this other term or this other image, you see number 4, justice for Black Lives Matter. We have seen that over the last several months since the murder of George Floyd and the many others who have been cited because of their murders. So we have come to some degree moving forward in our culture, in our nation, but a lot has not changed. And I'm very hurt and sorry to say that. Sorry to have to claim that, but it's true. And it also just means those of us who are still here to tell the story, still here to tell the narrative, we have to keep telling it. And we have to make sure that the narrative is told in its rightful way. The Voting Rights of 1965, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, I put that in because it was also a watershed time in which President Lyndon Johnson said, we will have voting rights for African Americans, and we will make sure that they are protected in their voting rights and that they are not redlined or pushed back or not allowed to vote. Interestingly enough, the current issues now surrounding the Trump administration, as you may know, just in 2019, there was a great number of Republicans who disagreed in having the Voting Rights Act continue in these next years of the 21st century. Now the deceased Congressman John Lewis was at the helm of that discussion and of that debate, that we still definitely need the Voting Rights Act and the protection of it, even now, even as we go into an election year in 2020 and into the next decade. Certainly we've seen this, the police and military systems, again, part of that institutional system of racism, the institutional system of domination and control, and how oftentimes Black individuals are seen as the threat, seen as the problem of our society, and therefore harsher tactics are often afforded to them. Then in the healthcare system, we have issues that we call bad medicine, the harm that comes from racism. This image shows systemic racism is a public health crisis. And there's a group around the country called #WhiteCoats for Black Lives Matter. or white coats for Black lives, I think it's called. In the notion of institutional racism in the healthcare system, I just wanted to show you some work that's been done with various US Census data. For this one in 2006 shows the percentage of persons in poverty and the race and ethnicity. We see in 2006, and of course, as you know, the census is coming up soon, so we'll be getting new data on what are some of these. Who is at the highest rate in poverty? Well, we see according to this statistic, American Indians are First Nation individuals at 26.6, and the next group of persons are the underrepresented communities of African Americans at 25.3. Then Hispanic individuals come in at 21.5, and then on. We have biracial, or two races of mixed individuals. And then we have Asian American Pacific Islanders that come in at 16.1. So we can see the disparity. We call this in health disparities. And we see the racial ethnic composition very much as what I had shown you just before. Let me just move this over. And then I'd like for you to see how segregation can affect health, because this is very much a part of our health disparities discussions around segregation, and how when we segregate our different neighborhoods, it causes pathogenic neighborhood and housing conditions that are linked to segregation in terms of health behaviors and unhealthy behaviors that occur. And then also there's medical care, the lack of access to care, and the social determinants of health that also affect segregation, neighborhoods that are separate and not equal. We see that in terms of living conditions, employment, poor foods that are in stores. There may not even be markets. There may only be liquor stores that have few types of healthy food. So all of this contributes, with segregation, contributes to the way in which we are affected by health. Percent of whites agreeing that Blacks and whites are. So if you see that this was a study done by Davis and Smith in 1990. The Davis is not me, I should say, where they looked at about 70 individuals and they asked them various questions. How do you perceive whites and Blacks in terms of their propensity for being lazy, their propensity for being preferred or having a preference to welfare, their proneness to violence, or the fact that they may be unintelligent? What is your perception? And as you see, the percentage of Blacks agreeing that Blacks and whites are lazy, well, Blacks saw that. The percent of whites agreeing and whites agreed that. But there was also this implicit view of racism, or this internal sense of racism is also seen in the way in which Blacks and whites perceive of each other. Then we also have infant mortality rate. That is a very big issue in the Black community, even as we speak. Many women have, Black women have issues of weathering. That means they have gone through so much stress, issues of racism in their lives. This has also been noted in our journals, our medical journals, and some of our behavioral journals, that this notion of weathering can be seen in terms of its effect, the notion of the effects of stress on Black mothers particularly, and the infant deaths that occur because of that stress. And then finally, I have, in terms of the health section of institutional racism, that Black men, even now when we're dealing with the COVID-19 coronavirus, which death do they choose? Many Black men fear wearing a mask more than the coronavirus. This was an article that came out in on June 3rd this year, just last month. And that's the other thing, is so much is evolving. Even as we're speaking, there's more that's coming out, and it's a treasure trove of data, but also you can barely keep up with it because there's so much that's being revealed.
I want to go swimming in Greg's pool.
Okay. And then the education system.
I want to go swimming in Greg's pool or in the ocean. Nothing.
I think someone is speaking, and that is not me. We're not going swimming in anyone's pool at the moment. So
Can
the
you hear me
education
now?
system. If someone can please mute that person. The education system is also an institution of systemic racism. We see here that Black and African American households generally have less access to computers and internet across the states. You know, you can see where Arizona is in each of these. These are Black households, these are white households, and then Hispanic households. And I put this up because I'm very concerned, as I'm sure you are, about the proportion of Black, white, and Hispanic households with access to internet, because our children are now going to remote instruction. We're going to remote instruction at Arizona State University. And this is a major, major concern. This source was from the Fletcher School at Tufts University, where they came out with a lot of data around the households. Another issue that we have to think about in terms of institutionalized racism in our schools. And again, young Hispanic, Latino, or Latinx students are also concerned about not having internet access at home. Now, cultural racism, I call a narrative of fabric, because it's the interweaving of these different aspects of culture. And I'd like to mention to you and have you see here that when we define culture, we talk about it in terms of the system of how we understand the world around us. It's a knowledge comprised of attitudes, beliefs, norms, and behaviors, ceremonies, nonverbal and verbal symbols, rituals, all of the things that we learn about and ways that we find how we can construct our world, our social world, our personal world, but how we manage in our lives in the world that we live in. Then there's something called the culture of whiteness. If you can think about all that aspect of culture, and then this notion of whiteness is a little different variation to that notion of culture. It means that whiteness is a racialized identity that refers to the way white people, their customs and their beliefs operate. And I'm going to move along here so that you can probably take a look at this and read it a little quicker. I don't have to go through it with you. Racism is shaped by culture. And by that, I'd like you to think about the idea of white privilege. Peggy McIntosh, a very noted author and one who speaks out about white privilege, is like, she says, an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, and blank checks. And then there's a way that she says, if you look in your day-to-day living, you may not realize that you are someone who has the advantage of white privilege until you start seeing how a day-to-day life looks like in the realm of white privilege. One is I can, if I wish to, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. I can avoid spending time with people who I was trained to mistrust and who have learned to mistrust my kind of people. Another one is I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. I can turn on the television or open the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented. Now, when you don't think along these lines, you might say, well, isn't that the norm for everyone? Isn't that normal? No, it's not normal if you are not white. White privilege comes this notion of normalcy, this notion of standard. It's a standard way of looking at the world through the eyes of being white. And racism shapes our culture too. It shapes us by the way in which we teach our children about existing and the way in which we find how easy or how difficult is it to interact with other people and get to understand their voices. if they are different than ourselves. Culture is shaped by racism, oftentimes by access or the lack of access to care, to education, to employment, and to housing. And it's because of discrimination. Everyday discrimination, and you can read that. Sometimes those who are not within the privilege of whiteness are treated with less courtesy than other people, are treated with less respect than other people today, right today in 2020. People act as if they think you are not smart, or that they are afraid of you if you're in an elevator or walking down the street. Or sometimes you may be at a store and they may think that you are dishonest if you are from someplace else. And then you may also be called names or insulted or threatened or harassed. And then here, I'd like to have you think about this in terms of culture. Please listen for a couple of minutes, James Baldwin, and find out where do you stand as you think about these issues.
It comes as a great shock to discover that the country, which is your birthplace and to which you owe your life and your identity, has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you. It comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover that the flag to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover that Gary Cooper killing off the Indians when you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you. When I was growing up, I was taught in American history books that Africa had no history, and neither did I. That I was a savage, about whom the less said the better, who had been saved by Europe and brought to America. And of course, I believed it. I didn't have much choice. Those are the only books there were. I am stating very seriously, and this is not an overstatement, I picked the up, and I carried rocket, and I built the railroad under someone else's whip for nothing. For nothing. If one has got to prove one's title to the land, isn't 400 years enough? 400 years, at least 3 wars. The American soil is full of the corpses of my ancestors. Why is my freedom or my citizenship or my right to live there, how is it conceivably a question now? What we are not facing is the results of what we've done. What one begs the American people to do for all our sakes is simply to accept our history until the moment comes when we, the Americans, we, the American people, we are trying to forge a new identity for which we need each other. Until this moment, there is scarcely any hope for the American dream, because the people who are denied participation in it, by their very presence, will wreck it.
That's a very powerful clip. And James Baldwin, the late James Baldwin, implores us to get it right. He says we can get it right. We have to accept the history, but we also have to make sure that it does not happen again. We have to find ways to come together, ways to understand one another, accept one another, embrace one another. Even though we can't embrace physically in COVID-19 era, but you know what I mean. The idea of understanding our collective histories, understanding our collective humanities. I mean, you know, what can I say? Human, we really are a part of a human family. We bleed the same, and on and on. I don't need to preach about that, but you know where I'm going, because it's the truth. We are human beings. We are of the same species, and yet we haven't come to grips. I am hopeful, however, what I have seen in these last few months of a lot of young people and older people too saying, enough, we do not want to live in this kind of world. And COVID, I think that this pandemic has helped people to see and reconsider what the world could be, what happens to the new generation that's coming, because there are babies who are being born right now, right at this moment, that are being born into the world through COVID, through these issues of anti-racist protests, and what are we doing to make it better for them? They're the newest people on the planet. So hopefully you will be thinking and self-reflecting on James Baldwin's discussions. Now we're almost done here, but let me move on into the personal aspect of racism. This is called a narrative of self and self-reflection. Now we're getting to where we have to say, okay, that was out there with institutions of maybe hiring practices and education, and certainly the health system with health equity and health disparities, and maybe even housing. But now, what are we going to say about when it comes to, as Michael Jackson says, looking at the man in the mirror? Microaggressions. I know that Ms. Deshay said that there will be a discussion on microaggressions and white fragility and some of your other upcoming series around uncomfortable dialogues, and you'll learn more about microaggressions. But microaggressions are those, they're almost like little pinpricks, and I'm doing this, you can see me, little pinpricks that are said to you. Usually they're racist statements, like what the individuals are holding up. You're not like the other Black people I know. You speak so well. You're so articulate. Well, how smart are you? Look at that. And you really are cute for a dark girl. Surprisingly, some of us, even here on this webinar, might have even experienced some of these same terms. And what do you do with them? How do you manage that? How do you deal with a trauma like that against your person when you know that they're not compliments? They really aren't. Although oftentimes those who are giving the compliments do feel that they are, because their lexicon, their language, their source of knowledge has already been tainted by the understanding that you are an other, you are a marginal person. You can't just be beautiful. You can't be really, really pretty if you are not of the standard that has been decided upon of what beauty is. And we know that usually is referring to blonde, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, within the standard of whiteness. White savior complex is another aspect of personal racism or personal bias, stereotyped belief system. The belief system that says the folks who are of minority extraction, those who are of minority races, really do need my help because they really can't do things, or they can't move forward in their lives. They don't have the wherewithal, and it's my responsibility to do it for them or to help guide them. Now you might say, well, what's wrong with that, Dean Davis? What's wrong with helping other people? Nothing is wrong at all about helping, but the white savior complex suggests that there is no sense of a history of those people. There's no sense of an understanding that they have intellectual abilities, that they have a culture long before you came into their lives, that they have knowledges that maybe you've not even had a chance or have given them a chance to talk about, because the white savior complex erases who they are, erases their intelligence, erases their culture, erases their beauty. And so once you erase other people, the only person or persons you see are the ones who are the standard, that imbue or embrace all the things that you have erased from the others. So then the only person who can help is that complex of, I'm going to help them because they can't help themselves. Now, again, I'm not saying not to help. So please underscore what I'm saying. Yes, in fact, we all must help. But in helping, we are also respectful that there are others, there are other people, other ways that they learn, other knowledges that they have. And we are there to assist, to collaborate, to be a part of a participatory engagement with them, and not lead out as though we in our privileged environments, our white privileged environments, feel that it's only our story that helps them. Color blindness, this notion of I don't see you, I don't see your color. It's to suggest that it's, if I say that, then that means that I'm not looking at you in a negative way. But it also says, if you don't see my color, then you really aren't seeing me either, because very much a part of who I am it's part of my contextual makeup. I am, for myself or any others who are of other minorities. So for whiteness or white privileged individuals to say, well, I don't see your color. I just see you as a person. It's one of those microaggressions, because in order for you to see me, you have to deny my color, deny my features, my hair texture, my experiences. Well, then you really aren't seeing me for who I am. And as Langston Hughes said, if you saw me for who I am, you would be ashamed, and you would remember, hopefully, that I too am America. Intersectionality refers to those interconnected nature of social categorizations like race, gender, class. You'll also hear more about that in the upcoming series, but it's through awareness of intersectionality. It's weaving those connections between race, gender, class, sexuality also, that also overlap in many of our systems of discrimination and disadvantage. So if we, for example, see a woman who is of Native American descent, we can't just say, oh, she's a Native American woman. Let's talk about her gender. We have to also talk about her race, her class, her economic status, all of the aspects of the social determinants that oftentimes regard her within the system of discrimination and disadvantage. Kimberly Williams Crenshaw was one of the proponents of this notion of intersectionality. As she looked as a lawyer, she helped to create the critical race theory that many of us use in some of our work. Dr. Crenshaw said, if we aren't intersectional, some of us, the most vulnerable, are going to fall through the cracks. Also, part of this notion of just understanding where slavery is in terms of its historical context, its historical implications, we oftentimes hear this, and I have heard this. I have also, it's been reported to me as a dean that sometimes in classes, students who are in privileged positions of the dominant culture of whiteness will make comments in classes such as, and this was a quote, well, slavery was a long time ago. I didn't have slaves. My family, to my knowledge, didn't have slaves. Why are we still talking about it? It's over. Get over it. And then the Black students or the Native students in the class feel extremely highly insulted, but also not just marginalized, but what to say. and then traumatized, horrified by a comment that way, then also instructors, professors have no idea what to say, because they too have not been trained about, through our institutionalized racist curriculum that doesn't always include the history and the stories that we're talking about now, the lived experience of individuals. So everyone is just standing or sitting in the classroom looking at one another, what to say. And that empty, odoriferous quote is said and just hangs there like coronavirus droplets. Finally, in my conclusion, I want to say a narrative of color is what we've been talking about in this past hour. We've talked about narrative as being the contextual component for understanding race and racism. We talked about the ways in which institutionalized racism, cultural racism, and personal racism or personal bias contributes to this system, this systemic way that we are each addressing, or even if we're not addressing it, we are affected. White individuals are affected just as much as Black and other minority and people of color populations are. And if we don't see ourselves collectively coming together to say enough, 2020 has been a year that has been unprecedented. None of us expected this. But it also has pulled back the scab, if you will, pulled back the narrative, has given us opportunities to create new narratives, narratives of inclusion, as DLA is trying to encourage and implore us to do, narratives of participation, collectively participating, and new ways of saying, we've got to get it right, and we have an opportunity to get it right because we are all still here. This conversation that we've had today has been proposed to set the tone. I hope that you have seen that I've set the tone for some wonderful conversations that are going to come after my talk. And again, I'm so very happy and honored to have been asked to be your speaker today. Now, where do we go from here? Well, from here, literally, we are going to go to our breakout session.
Welcome. Wow. Do you all know how powerful this is to see your faces all across the screen? This is the world I want to live in. All these smiles smiling back at me. This is glorious. Welcome back. Welcome back. How is your dialogue? Good? Yes? Excellent, excellent, good. The chat room is now open for your comments and questions. I know one lucky chat room got Dr. Davis in it, so I don't know who the lucky few were that got a chance to have okay, good. I see a few nods, so you got a chance to get Dr. Davis in there to get it right from the glorious woman there. So what we want to do now is we would love to hear some of your questions as you sort of to dissect the question that we posed to you. And so, Brent, do we want to put the question back up? Dr. Davis, do we have the presentation? Do we want to put that question back up? So,
I can put it in the chat also.
That'd be great. So what we would like to do is if you have a comment, if you have a question that you want to ask, and it doesn't necessarily have to be for the breakout that you just had. It could be for something you saw in the presentation previously that you want to just ask. Now is the time to do so. And what we would like you to do is to unmute yourself, and you can address Dr. Davis directly with your question. And so if you are ready, if you would please wait for our programmer, Dr. Scholar at the top there, to call on you. And we would love to be able to answer as many questions as we have time for. But we will make a commitment that if we don't get to your question and we do run out of time, we will make sure that we answer the questions in the chat section. So when we have the video go up on our website and our YouTube channel, that we have an answer. So we won't leave you hanging. We promise we will have some answers for you. Hello to Don Logan. Mr. Logan, sir, welcome. Good to see you. So if we're ready, Dr. Scholar, do we have some questions in the chat area that we can address?
We don't have that many questions. People wanted to talk more though, so now's your chance. If you raise your hand, I can make sure we call on you. I love what Joyce has to say. Just so you know, I'm going to shout this out just in case the person's not looking at the chat. Joyce Fort, whoever she was in the chat room with, and someone says, I just want to learn how to love, she would like to connect with you. So please make sure to do that. Dr. Davis, for a little bit, can you finish? I guess you were talking in your room. Can you talk about, just round up your discussion that you were doing there? Betty asked for that, and then we can go from there.
Sure, absolutely. And I wanted to say thank you to the chat room that we had. I think we were chat room 3. Betty and Jose, and I think Stuart, Katie, Minnie, several of you were there, and then certainly Sylvia. Wonderful comments and experiences, narratives, stories were shared. I was mentioning in response to something that Katie had said. Katie is a new, I hope it's all right that I mention this, Katie. Katie is a new person. Her family has recently moved here to Arizona about a month ago. She's from, or at least was living in Minneapolis or in Minnesota. So she was there at the time of the George Floyd murder and protests. And she mentioned taking her 2-year-old son to ice cream and going through the streets and seeing many of those places boarded up. And they said, this is a Black-owned business, this is a brown-owned business, written across or painted on the building. She also mentioned that a lot of looting was happening and different kinds of pillaging of the community, and she didn't understand that. And I was saying that there was a piece, I would have liked to have put it in my piece, but I saw a clip, excuse me, of a young woman who had mentioned the same thing, African-American woman, and created this idea of the metaphor. I won't go into it, it's a long metaphor, but basically she was saying people always wonder and focus on those who are pillaging. But if you realize it, they're pillaging, and people will say, why are they tearing down their community? They didn't care anything about it. She said the reason why that happens is because Black people don't own their communities. They don't own the houses. They don't own insurance, health insurance. There's not a sense of a government or a city leaders that really care about the community, unless of course it's for their vote, for election time, or they will try to coalesce and come together as a community, but they're trying to do that on their own. It has to be on their own. So this clip was saying, when there's a time to find a way to appreciate the community and appreciate by having an economic foundation, much like what people were trying to do 100 years ago in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to have that foundation of loving your community because you also own it. I have come from a family, my father was the Tulsan who has connected me to Tulsa, and all I heard when I was a little girl, you must own your own business, you must own your own university. Okay, so Davis University, I haven't gotten there yet. But own your own house. Don't have a mortgage. Pay it off or pay cash. So I always learned about owning whatever I have, because that was the narrative that was spread through Tulsa, Oklahoma.
We've got a comment from Obi, is it, Dr. Scholar?
Yeah, Obi, actually, lots of people are asking to hear her story. So Obi, if you would please unmute and join us.
Sure. Hello, guys.
Hi, Obi.
How are you?
It's been a pleasure really spending today with you guys. I really have to say I've learned so much from each and every one of you, and I feel like I'm blessed to be taking part in this meeting. The reason why I'm saying that is because I started telling, I was in the middle of telling my experience, my story, being the fact that I'm from a different culture, originally born and raised in Nigeria, but I moved out to the States in 2005. I remember very well the time during Hurricane Katrina, and coming to a country where you have to basically, where you're trying to look for a change for your life hasn't really been all that easy. But in all of it, I feel like I'm learning, and continuously I keep learning every day. Um, there's a lot of things. My story that I was going to share with my group has to do with you know how my culture doesn't really embrace uh, anyone that is transitioning from one gender to another. And in our culture, we look at it as a taboo. But coming to America pretty much has exposed me to accept the fact that you're not just looking at somebody um, who wants to change from a gender of male or female to any other gender that they would like be to embrace, but rather you're looking at another human being like yourself. And I had uh, a past former coworker that I worked with, who actually transitioned from a female to male. And I recall, kind of like thinking that that was awkward. And at the time, I didn't really, you know, understand the impact of the way I was looking at my coworker at that time could have made them felt. But over the years, I've been in the United States and coming to learn a couple of things here and there. I've come to accept the fact that you might be of a different culture that doesn't believe in certain things, but when you recognize the fact that you're dealing with somebody who is human like yourself, there's nothing bigger than that, regardless of you know what direction they choose to go in life, they choose what path they decide to take in life. You just have to be able to accept the fact that love, overcomes, and all, is greater than all things. And I also have had several experiences for the fact that, you know, our country today has, we're dealing with a lot of racial tension. It's been ongoing. Some of the things I know today about America, I didn't know before I came out, to live in the United States. But, also being the fact that, I now have kids of my own, and I am in an interracial marriage. I look at my wife and I look at my kids, and I'm like, how would I want my kids to grow up? So, I feel like, we are, like Dr. Davis pointed out, we are the same regardless of our color, regardless of our race. And honestly, we I at one point felt like I've treated, someone else of a different race in a certain way that I can look back and be like I wasn't proud of. Yes, we found ourselves in situations where we've had to kind of like, even if it's not by action, just by a thought, you know. But every day I try to be better about how to handle such experiences, and try to kind of like exhibit, show more love towards any individual that crosses my path. And I feel like, regardless of what we're dealing with today in our country and its entirety, I know that we can definitely be the change that we're looking for. We can actually do better, even if somebody else that we know is refusing to do better or be better from us, showing them a different the way we treat them is what could possibly make them think about their behavior towards other people of a certain race.
So, Obi,
Great.
Yeah, that's excellent. Brent, just very quickly, we thank you very much. I'm smiling because I'm Nigerian also. I'm half Nigerian and half Russian, and I was born in Ghana. So I get it. I get it. There's a big cultural gap coming from another country, you know, coming here, and you know, there's a huge gap that exists, and also being biracial, right? So being half white and half black, and you know, there's a huge divide. So I think for all of us, the thing is, bias exists for everybody. And so when I meet people that say, and I met a young lady the other day, she says, I don't have any biases, and I said, oh, honey, spend 10 minutes with me and I'll identify a few that you didn't even know existed for you. It's okay to have them. What you do from that point on is the critical part, right? It's like acknowledging you have a bias and then working consciously, right, to figure out how to overcome them, how to move past them, and not how to repeat them, right? Because they exist within all of us. Some very minute, you know, some very small. You know, I have a son who has autism, and I chuckle when people talk to him, because when people speak to him, they speak very loudly. You know, they're like, "Hi, and I'm like, you know, he's not hearing impaired, right? He hears beautifully. That's not one of his issues. So I'm gonna need you not to shout at him. You know what I mean? And he's always like, why is that person shouting at me? It is something that we just all, you know, and it's almost, and we make light of it a little bit, but we all have them, right? Recognizing it and going, oh, I didn't even realize that I do that. And this was a neighbor, and the neighbor does it all the time, right? Recognizing that you do it, and that's how you stop the behavior. But you have to recognize that the behavior actually exists before you can kind of move past it. So Brent, do we have any other questions?
We have a comment and then or an international question. So we're going to go, Lewis, if you can unmute, please. And then Rico, you'll be up next to be able to ask your question. We're going to have to keep it a little short because we are nearing that 11 o'clock hour. So about a minute.
Right. So we'll go question and then we go to our video. That's how we're going to.
Okay. All right. So my name is Louis Andre Brownlee. I work at Estrella Mountain Community College. And I want to talk about real quick about that comment about destroying our communities. I feel like that's a loaded question sometimes, because we only get that question when, you know, minoritized people do it. But I always try to put in perspective like history. So a friend of mine recently, she teaches at a Erie public school, and she asked me the same question. And I said, well, the way we were taught in history that the Boston Tea Party was the same thing, right? You had these men that dressed up as Native Americans that went onto these ships and destroyed over 300 boxes of tea, threw them into the ocean, and demanded that they be treated like human beings. And they came up with this mantra, you know, no taxation without representation. So when we go and do the same thing, we're considered to be short-sighted, savages. But that's the American way, is if you want your voice heard, is that you have to attack the capitalistic system. And she was like, well, I never looked at it that way. I said, yeah, because when white people do it, it's applauded, it's political, it's something to follow. But when we go through in our communities to bring attention to capitalistic oppression, then it's a negative thing that when we do it. So if there's a natural disaster and we go into stores to get necessities, we're looting, right? But when white people do it, they're surviving. So the narrative changes when you introduce racism and color into it. So a lot of those communities, I'm originally from Atlanta, so I'm watching the news and I'm watching some of my brothers and sisters in Atlanta go into these stores and you know, show their frustration. And I try to explain to people also, what you're seeing is a generation of compounding of aggression, right? That has come downhill and has exploded in this generation. So a lot of these young people and people that are protesting all together, they're carrying their mothers, their grandmothers, their great-grandmothers, their great-great-grandmothers, frustration and rage, right? That has exploded. So I find that the bias, and I'm gonna go back to the Boston Tea Party, you have these men that own slaves, that endorse slavery, that are running onto these ships, destroying property, talking about, you know, you're taxing us and you're treating us like slaves, when they have the foot and their knee on the necks of African American in the community. So it's always this level of hypocrisy when you throw race on there. And so I tell people, look at your history books. When white people do it, it's okay. But when we do it right, it's an issue. It's highlighted, you know, and we see that with rap music. We see that in other forms of African expression, and even within literacy. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Louis. I have to stop you because we have another question. It's a great, you know, great conversation starter. Everyone can think about it. But I'd like to ask Rico to please unmute and ask his question to Dr. Davis.
Yes, hello. I'm from Germany. My name is Rico, and as I follow the news right now about the US as well, about the demonstrations, about the race and stuff, all I read is only the two topics about like the coronavirus right now in the USA and like the demonstrations about racism and stuff. And I wonder, as that's all I read about all the time when it comes to the USA, if like the subject about racism and stuff in the USA is like only one like minor part of a big discussion going on, which probably we don't hear about in Germany, or if this is like one of the main topics, which is, you know, like discussed every day also now with the upcoming election. And yeah, I just want to know if my impression here from Germany is correct, if it's all about this topic right now, or if that's actually, you know, just my impression from here reading the news. Yeah, because as I don't know that many people from the US, or actually I don't have someone to write with about, I would like to know how big this topic is like in reality, you know.
And Brent, was that a question for me?
Yes.
Okay. I'll just say this very quickly. Rico, I think is your name. Hello, and thank you for being here all the way from Germany. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Well, you are correct. I'm going to say this in terms of our media, in terms of our journalistic outlets. Everywhere you go, when you see it on the news, all of our news outlets, whether it be on online or on television or on radio, is a cacophony of voices. It's just inundated with the stories about coronavirus, COVID-19, lack of PPE, that's, you know, our necessary equipment for our clinicians and first responders, you know, everything that's happening. And of course, we're hearing a lot about the health disparaged populations, Latinx and African American and American Indian particularly, those three, as well as others. But because of those comorbidities, those added health problems, we see it heightened. So yes, you are correct. That's true. We have a lot of that's going on. So you see that. Then also different issues around George Floyd and others, the list of individuals who we oftentimes hear of who are who died, who were murdered at the hands of police, is also very much a part of our discussion, even though it's been now I think a couple of months since George Floyd's murder. It's still very, very prevalent. You might have seen or heard about Portland, Oregon and Seattle, Washington. Our northwestern states here in the United States are having a lot of protests. We're seeing more military brutality where military officers are coming in and just taking people and putting them in cars and driving them away. People don't even know where they're going. This is like we're in some other kind of world, some dystopian world that is saying we own you and we decide what you will and will not say, and if we don't like it, we're taking you and we're putting you away. So it's something that speaks of similar types of experiences and life histories that we saw, of course, in your country, I'm sorry to say, with Hitler and the Nazis and that whole experience with the Holocaust and with Jews and how rapidly all of this is happening. That's what I keep reminding myself, that we as Americans tend to go, oh, well, you know, I've got to get to campus because I have to be dean today, and I'll listen to the news later, but I've got to get to this meeting. When whirlwinds are happening so quickly, we realize that that the tide is turning. I mean, some of us do because we have our pulse on it, but I mean, we can get so caught up in our routines and our comfortable, somewhat comfortable lifestyles in America that we don't forget how quickly and how insidious something can change before we realize it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I am so grateful to Dr. Davis for her time and her expertise. Can we just give her a little air clap? Yes, thank you, Dr. Davis. Yay.
My pleasure. It's been wonderful. Thank you, everyone.
You are delightful. You are a wealth of information. And I know you kind of just did a overarching broad brush stroke, if you would, but we have grown and learned so much from you today. And thank you for setting such a high bar and setting a wonderful tone for our dialogue series on conversations that ignite change. As you guys know, before we leave, I want to leave you with a video. We always like to leave you with an imagery to remind you, as Dr. Davis said, that we are all human. So our video we leave you with was before you call the cops.
Before you call the cops, I just want you to know the first thing that I did when I woke up this morning was yell at my alarm clock. My parents were raised in the South. I have to roll Tide or they'll disown me. They raised me in Las Vegas. That city still has my heart. I hate spiders. I'm a vegetarian. I'm not proud about it. I've done goat yoga. I'm really not proud about that. I can tell you every single word off the NWA Straight Outta Compton album. I can also sing you every single word from Oklahoma. Bananas are disgusting. I am a Christian. I spend almost every Sunday morning teaching kids in Sunday school. I am often asked if I am Muslim. I'm okay with that. I'm pretty much convinced if you met my mother, you'd automatically become a better person. My father is a veteran. He taught me how to say yes, sir, and yes, ma'am, to everyone that I meet. I don't hate our president. I pray for him. I love basketball and also hockey. This is my brother, James. This is my brother, Mike. This is my brother, John. And this is my brother, Rob. This is my niece, Zoe. This is my nephew, Justin. This is my niece, Allie. This is my nephew, Declan. This is my nephew, Jordan. I've never been to jail. I've never owned a gun. I hate that anyone at all might possibly be afraid of me. I'd go around the world and back again if I knew that single act might make your day better. I'm a proud man. I'm a proud black man. Does any of this really matter? No. I just wanted you to get to know me better before you called the cops.
Thank you so much for joining us for a dialogue series on systemic racism, equity, and belonging. This has been Uncomfortable Conversations that Ignite Change by Diversity Leadership Alliance. We will see you next month on August the 27th, I believe it is, Thursday, where we will talk about implicit racial bias. In the meantime, stay healthy, stay sane, right? And most importantly, stay safe, learn to be kind, and learn to love each other. Have an amazing day. We'll see you next time. Cheers. Bye-bye.